understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
Hey there, John here, podcast time. And today we have a special episode that was recorded live at the Kilkenomics Festival 2024. Now, we were on stage at the Watergate Theatre in Kilkenny just a day after the results of the US election. So, inevitably, Trump was the hot topic. But in the podcast, we focused on how Trump marks the beginning of a new era, or epoch as Mac refers to it. Now, you could say that we've experienced three different political and economic epochs since the Second World War. But what is different about this Trump epoch, and what can we expect? Well, let's have a listen.
What a week, Mark. I mean, you just set it up there as what was going on. I don't know about you guys. I love all the kind of American election stuff, and I tried to stay up for the whole night, and it didn't work. I gave up about 2 o'clock, but at about 2 o'clock, I was watching CNN and, Sky News and all the usual Turkish TV, actually, as well. But
one of John's specialities, by the way.
But they're all saying more or less the same thing. Nothing to worry about. This is all to be expected and blah, blah, blah. So I went boring, went to bed, got up, set the clock for 6 a.m. I don't see that time in the morning very often.
No, you don't.
And came down. And you could see, but even before the sound came on, the CNN guys had dropped about a foot. And you could see, I just knew what had happened. And I just got on the phone and block booked therapy sessions. But interestingly, I was talking to my daughter, and the night before she came to me, Emma, and she said to me, she was really worried. She's got quite engaged and involved in the whole thing, which is brilliant. But she was really genuinely worried about this. And I was trying to lay her fears, going, no, look, it's fine, Trump won't get in, it'll be Kamala and blah, blah, blah. And then the next morning, I kind of was tiptoeing around going, have you heard the results? And she was genuinely upset. But I was talking to a lot of people after that. Loads of kids are really upset by this.
Well, I think loads of people are
not just kids, but everybody. But it does affect kids a lot.
There's also, and I think it's important to think, there's loads of people very happy too.
Well, true.
Look, the thing about Trump is, and by that I mean, he won the popular vote in the United States. Trump is many things, but he is a phenomenal politician. And by that I mean, America has been defined by big political clans, in effect, over the last 20 or 30 years. The Bushes, the Clintons,
Kennedys,
the Obamas, but no, in the last 20 years.
Oh yeah, sure.
The Obamas and the Bidens, right? These are big families. These are big beasts. Trump has destroyed the Clintons, the Bushes, the Obamas, and the Bidens. So what he does, how he engages with America, how he speaks to people, how he manages to identify all the various different constituencies of disaffected people, means to me that he is an amazing, and I say this, politician in the sense of somebody who can win elections.
Yeah.
And that is something that I think sometimes gets masked here.
But politics in itself has changed. I mean, the key issues, as we kept hearing, were immigration and cost of living, inflation and cost of living. Now, we're kind of in a whole new era now, really. As you say, politics has changed. But what's your take on that?
The way I look at, John, you know this, I tend to try to look at politics and economics and sociology and culture through much longer lenses than we tend to have. So we tend to be focused on the 4-year horizon. But over the last few years, I've come to look at it, maybe not in the few years, maybe the last 10 years. And we've written about this, we've done podcasts on it. I've come to look at politics through what I call supercycles. These are possibly 3 or 4 decade-long cycles where the underlying tone, the underlying momentum, and the underlying concerns and solutions offered by the political class in general shift. And I think what we're seeing right now is America is in a transition between one supercycle, which I'll explain in a second, and this new supercycle, which we can broadly call Trumpism. And I don't think Trumpism is going away. I think it's actually possibly the defining political set of ideas of our epoch. And I also think it will be exported around the world.
Are you actually saying, or could you argue that Trump is a bit of a visionary? I mean, if you took the name Trump out of that...
I wouldn't say visionary. I'll come back. But he is something that many people don't give him due credit for.
Yeah.
Now, excuse me, this big supercycle idea is probably every 3 or 4 decades. And since the Second World War, America has had 2 major supercycles over a 40-year period. So over 80 years, 2 major ones. And now we're transitioning to a 3rd one. And the way you see it is if you look at America, John, since the Second World War, so let's say 1945, 46, in fact, 1947, which was the Bretton Woods conference that basically set up the post-Second World War global economic architecture, hugely influenced by Keynes, J.M. Keynes from Cambridge in England. But that period from about 1947 to about 1977, that 30-odd year period, was defined by an America that was quite anti-immigration. This is the first thing.
Yeah.
Very few immigrants in America coming to America, even in those years, relative to what's going on now. But it was big government, reasonably, and for America, very high rates of taxation, very large dependency on the government. The ideas were all Keynesian. They were all very much a focus on making American life better through big state. They, of course, exported that to the UK, and the UK picked that up with the welfare state as well. And the leading intellectual, though the godfather intellectually was J.M. Keynes, the great British economist, but the major spokesperson, or an agitator, was a guy called J.K. Galbraith, who was a Canadian economist, very man who wrote The Affluent Society. And interestingly, probably the high point of this supercycle was the JFK administration.
Was he an advisor to JFK?
He was an advisor to JFK. JFK was very taken by these ideas.
Right.
And JFK set up something that Johnson ran with called the Great Society. And that was a massive move in the United States in the 60s to really alleviate much of American poverty through very large public works schemes. So America then looked and felt very much like Europe.
Yeah.
Now, all these supercycles seem to me to have, in their very success, the seeds of their own destruction.
Yeah.
And the supercycle of Keynes and Galbraith and the big ideas and the Great Society come to an end in and around the early 1970s.
So this after the summer of love and everyone took too much LSD and it just all fell apart.
In fact, John, I was writing today, hippies destroyed the great... They did. Hippies destroyed it. They destroyed everything.
Goddamn hippies.
But the next supercycle comes, and it's again another about 40 years. It's again championed by a politician in the same way as JFK championed the old one, championed by Reagan. It comes from the ideas of a guy called Hayek, an Austrian economist, and the chief spokesperson or proselytizer for that in America in the 1970s, Milton Friedman.
Right.
And their idea is the polar opposite to the Keynes idea. They're saying small government, low taxes, free movement of capital, free movement of people, free movement of ideas, and get the state out.
But what was the transition, though, there? How did it change?
Well, actually, there's an intro. I think, John, the rumble in the jungle caused the change, right?
Right, Muhammad Ali caused the change.
Muhammad Ali.
Okay.
The rumble in the jungle, if anybody remembers, I remember it very, very well because my father rented a colour TV for the rumble in the jungle, and loads of people came around to our house. You were probably there as well, John, into our kitchen to watch the colour TV. It was 50 years ago last week, right? And the whole of Windsor Park arrived in the McWilliams kitchen, and because the rumble in the jungle was in Zaire, and they had to actually have the gig on, the fight on for American primetime television at 9 o'clock in New York.
Right.
It was at 2 a.m. in Ireland. So we all stayed up, the whole road stayed up watching the colour TV. And my greatest tragedy was the following day I came home from school hoping to get Tom and Jerry on the colour TV, and my dad had given it back. I swear to God. He rented it for one night. How mean is that? Yeah. Right?
That's what you call extravagant in its day.
From Eddie Totterdale's feckin' fellas in Dunleary. But the Rumble in the Jungle, the question is, why was the Rumble in the Jungle in Zaire? Why was it there? Why was it in Africa? And it was in Africa because it happened about a year after the oil crisis in 73. Yeah. And the oil crisis in 73 caused a massive, massive deluge of Western money to leave the West via the price of gas and end up in the petro-Arab states. At the time, they were nothing like they are now. They didn't have the capacity to spend that money, so they gave the money back to the American bankers. And the American bankers, largely Citibank, gave that money, lent that money to commodity-based countries. And the collateral was supposed to be the commodity, and Zaire was full. So they wouldn't have had the Rumble in the Jungle had it not been for this extraordinary spike in inflation coming through petrol prices.
So it's just to spend the money, like just wherever you can spend it.
It's basically the idea was that and you see that money flows all around the world, that the Arabs at the time weren't set up to absorb all this cash. Like, I mean, Dubai didn't exist as it does.
They didn't have the roads to drive the Lamborghinis.
No, didn't have all that stuff. Yeah. But that inflation destroyed the Great Society dream.
Right.
That prized open the opportunity for Friedman to find himself a backer. He found himself a backer in Ronnie Reagan, and Ronnie Reagan comes in 1979, 1980, and he profoundly changes America, and America goes on this, what we would describe as neoliberal path, which is the path that is now breaking down. And the reason it's breaking down, so that's a 40-year path.
Yeah.
The Americans export this idea to all over the world, right? And of course, another anniversary, it's coming up. Saturday is the 35th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this was the vindication that Reagan needed to say, look, the opposite ideology has collapsed. We're the last man standing. We're the only people standing. Absorb what we call the Washington Consensus.
Yeah.
And that was basically the economic model that we have been, in effect, growing up with.
Thatcher had been pushing this along as well. She had kind of absorbed all that from the early 80s and closed down all the mines and the heavy manufacturing, all that kind of stuff.
And a similar, the Rust Belt exists because a huge amount of American corporations took the idea. In fact, Milton Friedman came up with this idea called shareholder value. Yeah. And what he said was the only thing companies have to do is to maximize the profits for their shareholders. They have no other social, economic, or industrial function. And of course, what this did, this meant maximizing profits became the only mantra for large corporations in America. And they, of course, went to places where they could maximize profit.
Yeah.
Like us. So we are the direct beneficiaries of this process in the United States. We'll come back to see where we're in this jigsaw in a sec. But this probably should have come to an end in 2008 with the global financial crisis, but it didn't. It didn't because, the Federal Reserve with Bush and then Obama said, no, we're going to have a thing called QE. We're going to, in effect, print money to try and refloat the balance sheets of countries and individuals that have collapsed with this global financial crisis. And that, John, led to the extreme form of inequality we're seeing now. And the reason is the following. If you print money and reduce interest rates as your main weapon against a recession, what you will do is you will definitely refloat the balance sheet.
Yeah.
But you will reward people whose income comes from assets, because as interest rates fall, asset prices go up.
Yeah.
They're people who live on rents, dividends, those sort of things, personal wealth. But at the same time, if you're opening up your manufacturing base to China, for example, you're reducing profoundly the wages of people in America, and you're targeting those people who depend on wages for their income as opposed to those people who depend on dividends for their income. You do that for 7 or 8 years, you drive inequality.
Yeah.
You drive this sense of the left behinds. This is where Trump comes in.
But ironically, Trump was one of these asset holders as well, and he made his money on
the extraordinary thing about
extraordinary
thing about the Trump alliance now of billionaires and blue collar workers is that it's the alliance of winners and losers of QE. So the winners are the billionaires who finance it, and the losers are the former blue collar workers who are voting for them. But what has happened since then is if you look at a map of America, everyone is voting for Trump. Everyone is voting for Trump. It's not blue-collar workers. It's not just white people. It's not, not non-Latinos, non-black, women. The whole gamut voted for
Why
him.
do you think that was?
The reason it has broadened now, I think, is because we now have a movement.
Yeah.
And that movement is this third big supercycle. So we've gone from the Keynesian movement of big government to the Friedmanite movement of small government and free trade, free movement of capital, free movement of people, to a new model, a transition to new model, which is almost 19th century.
So what defines this new model then?
We are anxious, we are afraid, we feel we have been cheated.
Yeah.
Those people over there have done it to us. So we are America. We have two extraordinary oceans that protect us from ever being invaded. So we do not need to be the global policeman. What are we doing that for?
Yeah.
Right? That's the first thing. So we will isolate ourselves. Now, this is a very, very, very old strain in American political DNA. In fact, the big row between the man who introduced the dollar, Alexander Hamilton, in 1792, and Thomas Jefferson, the man who would become more emblematic of the American Republic, was over exactly this. In the Jeffersonian Republican, he was a part of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
In the Republican DNA, in the Jeffersonian DNA, has always been this slightly mythical, shining city on the hill view of the United States, that we isolate ourselves from everyone. And that's a very, very deep part of the DNA. And the rows between Hamilton and Jefferson, even at the end of the 18th century, were all about this. Hamilton was saying, no, we need the dollar, we need trade, we need money from the outside, all that sort of stuff.
He was big thinking.
He was a big thinker because he was influenced by a guy called Talleyrand, a French guy, the guy who financed the French Revolution. The guy who was called the Limping Devil, who was an archbishop with 7 children, which is quite impressive, right?
Well, it's the French way, isn't it?
Yeah, it is the French way. It is the French way, and it's amazing. He was very, very friendly with Hamilton. He had 7 children by various different mistresses. Hamilton loses his political power in America because he had an affair.
Yes.
Nothing changes.
Yeah.
Nothing changes. But the amazing thing about Hamilton ends up getting murdered by the vice president. And that actually happened. In 1803, Alexander Hamilton is murdered by a guy called Burr, who was the vice president.
This was in a duel.
A duel, exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, enough.
So Kamala
might just shoot Donny, and away we go. But if we come back to the idea that this isolation idea is very, very deep in American Republic Party DNA, number one. Number two, what Trump wants is he wants to rebuild American industry under the umbrella of tariffs. What the Americans have said, and his people have said, is we are self-sufficient. It's the only country that is self-sufficient in energy and food in the world, right? We do not need anybody else. We have everything here. And you'll notice that isolationism in America has become increasingly popular as they have become an increased energy exporter.
Yeah.
So the minute they started going for shale, this notion came back in, we don't need the rest of the world. So he's saying tariffs. And then he's saying to the left behinds who are saying, look, immigrants who don't look like us, who don't speak like us, who don't sound like us, they're in our hospitals.
Yeah.
They're pressing down on wages. They are in the schools of our kids. And Trump says to them, I've got a solution. So it's anti everything that went before.
Yeah.
It's anti-immigration, anti-free trade,
Yeah.
anti-being the global policeman, along which goes the IMF, the World Bank,
Yeah,
all
yeah,
those
yeah.
other institutions set up by the Keynesians. So this is a dramatic shift. Now, the interesting thing, John, is the Americans have done this before. In 1917, the Americans started to close their borders to immigrants. Prior to that, the immigrant population in America had been running at about 15% of the total. From 1917 to 1970, the proportion of immigrants as a percentage of the American population fell every single year.
Okay.
So they have closed their doors before.
Until when?
1970.
70,
and then they
okay.
start to rise again.
Yeah.
Right, 1970, right. So they've also been American industry in the main in the 19th century. The reason America emerges after the First World War as such a massive power is, number one, it lent all the money to the European combatants, so
Yeah.
it became the creditor. But number two, it had allowed its industries to develop protected by tariffs
Yeah.
for the whole 19th century. So when they got into the position of being the global leader, they were so much better
Yeah,
at
and
everything
then they could open
than anybody else.
Yeah.
So they've been, but my point is, Trump comes from a tradition.
Yeah.
He's not, and that tradition, we don't get it because we're a small country.
Yeah.
So we
yeah.
have to trade with everybody.
Yeah, we're just the beneficiaries or
We're the
whatever.
beneficiaries, yeah.
But the thing about this way of thinking of tariffs and isolationism and all the rest, there's just, I mean, just a little aside, it feels like this is like a global gated community for a start. But,
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it.
But the thing is that if America closes the borders, puts up tariffs, reduces foreign investment in other countries, what it does is they'll do better, and that's fine. But the rest of those developing countries and those other countries, their economies stagnate. So that actually creates a bigger immigration problem in many ways, because there's more people who
Banging
want to
on
be
the door.
knocking on the door, being economic migrants,
Well,
which is the very thing that they're trying to stop, you know?
I mean, what I'm just saying is that they can do this. This
Yeah.
is my point.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
at the moment, the economics profession, particularly the economists in Wall Street working for the big banks, who have a massive interest in continuing with the old game, they are saying, oh my God, this is going to destroy America, right? They're saying inflation is going to go through the roof, etc. This may well happen because if you take out, they're talking about, J.D. Vance said today, they're talking about deporting forcefully 1 million people a year,
Yeah.
right? Now, I don't know how they're going to do this.
Obama did the same.
Obama did the same,
Yeah.
but he was nice.
He did it with a smile.
He was on our side, yeah. No, but
Exactly,
I'm serious,
yeah.
but you're
Yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah.
So I think that because Trump now has a mandate, and because there is the checks and balances that those guys, Jefferson and Hamilton, the founding fathers, put into the American Constitution, because they are now all on his side, from the Supreme Court, probably the whole of the Hill, and he's the president and he's got the popular vote. I think they can do this,
Yeah.
right? And also there's a perception that the first Trump, was full of people that didn't expect to be in the job. They're like, what do we do here, right?
Rudy Giuliani is a great example, and
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, Rudy Giuliani was one of the most experienced of all of them.
Well, that's true.
You know what I mean?
yeah.
He was actually
Yeah, yeah.
quite a formidable politician.
But he had a leaky head.
So what I think, John, is we are hoping against hope that they can't do this, or they won't do it, or they'll be persuaded not to do it. My sense is we are going into this third epoch of an ideology which could last for a long time, unless they hit the buffers.
Okay, let me just ask you just about these epochs in general. So we've had 3, as you say, for the last...
3 since the Second World War, and then we had 1 or 2
Yeah, and there
prior
was
to
one
that,
before
yeah.
that. So do they have a natural lifespan, and are they predictable then?
Well, I think very few things are predictable. I mean,
Sure.
that's what deviled poor old Keynes all the time.
Yeah.
Because he was sitting talking to philosophers like Wittgenstein and Russell, and they were trying to figure out And his whole idea was...
It must be great crack.
They were great fun. They were good fun. They were in the hole in the wall drinking, talking about probability. Yeah. But their idea was, how do you figure out a world that's uncertain?
Yeah.
And many people have subsequently tried. In fact, I think that it's not that these long-term cycles are predictable, but what you do see is that after a while, they have the seeds of their own destruction. I think it's bizarre to say, but I think ideologies are like fashion. It's like punk rock, the high press in soccer, or flares.
High press in soccer.
Well, the high press never existed before. Do you know what I mean? This is a new concept. Anyway, the point is that...
It's lost on me.
I know, it's so funny. I talk football to Johnny, just flags. But the fascinating thing is that in these big super cycles, they start as regarded as radical, and then they become mainstream. And what was mainstream becomes redundant. And you have a whole intellectual, commercial, political apparatus that gets behind them as if there was never any other way of looking at the world. So had you said 10 years ago, we should have tariffs and we should close our borders. And another thing he's going to do quite soon is get one of his mates to run the Fed, which prints the money, right? If you'd said that a couple of years ago...
I bet he'll put his face on it, on the dollar bill as well. Wait till you see, he'll try and do something like that. And he'll turn it orange. It'll be an orange dollar bill. It won't be the greenback.
Exactly. It'll be like a Bitcoin dollar, the orange eyes. It's funny you talk about face on things. I'm going to digress now, but I've gone off on a thing. Mohammed Al-Fayed.
Yes.
I interviewed him.
Did you?
Many, many years ago for a show I did on TV3. And we had to go over to Harrods. And we arrived in Harrods and we were shown to the Tutankhamun room. I said, fine.
Brilliant.
He's Egyptian. Tutankhamun's Egyptian. That's grand. I'll do the pharaoh. Carry on. And there's Tutankhamun with the fake head. There's about 50 of these all around the ceiling. And I'm looking at the face, and it's Al-Fayed's face.
No way!
Yeah. I swear to Jesus, it was the maddest thing I'd ever. It was the maddest thing.
Oh, that's brilliant!
And I was gobsmacked by this, and then I was even more gobsmacked by the fact that we were interviewing in a place like this in the centre of the room, and the fella came in with a wooden box like this, and I said, "What's with the wooden box?" He stood up in it, so he looked big. So he looked about 7 foot tall.
For the pictures,
exactly. So I would be looking up at the great genius. Anyway. We are in a different world.
Yeah.
Now, ironically, there is one power base that could stop this.
Go on.
And bizarrely, it's the very power base that over the last 48 hours have celebrated Trump's victory, and it's the financial markets. So the financial markets, I mean, as a power base.
Yeah.
America has a massive national debt issue.
Yes.
Its national debt today is $30 trillion, which is 100% of GDP. Nobody's talking about this.
Yeah. Well, Elon Musk is the man who's been mentioning this for the last few months.
Well, Trump's economic policy, subscribed to by Elon Musk, according to the Congressional Budget Office, they think the central case on Trump for the years 2024 to 2032, if he gets in and his policies are enacted, is about a 7 trillion increase on that figure.
Yeah.
But there's a worst case scenario, which is a 14 trillion increase based on if the Americans have a recession, all that sort of stuff.
Wow.
Now, that means that within 10 years, the United States will have a debt GDP ratio of about 122% of GDP. Interest rates in America are about
Greece.
4. Greece is fine. And do you know why Greece is fine? They defaulted. The reason Greece... Do you know the amazing thing is? Greece's interest rates are lower than France's. And very soon they're going to be lower than Germany's.
Okay.
And it's, the whole world has changed. It's another thing about Europe. It's changed completely as to... very soon the pigs will be just the lords of the place. Remember we wrote pigs? Portugal, Ireland, Italy.
I'm looking forward to that.
So... But I think there is one place where I think America is on the road to a debt crisis. Now, it might not happen very soon, but the reason I think is the following. The very, very, very aggressive cleavage in America, where the liberals now hate the libertarians, right?
Yeah.
In the past, when America had debt crises, there's a guy called James Carville, the Raging Cajun,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And he said in 1997 that when he dies, he wanted to come back as the bond market, right? Because he said the bond market bullies politicians. They were called bond vigilantes. So they kept Clinton in check because Clinton's natural proclivity was to spend lots of money.
Okay.
But the interesting thing is Clinton and the man he hated and who hated Clinton was a guy called Newt Gingrich.
Oh, yeah, I remember.
But they were from a generation of American politicians that could walk across the aisle and do a deal. That's over now.
Yeah, which is Biden was one of them too.
He's gone. So the ability of the American system to deal with a runaway debt crisis, I think, has been profoundly compromised by the culture war, which has led to Trump.
So what would an American debt crisis look like then?
It would be very unusual because the dollar is the world's reserve currency.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't look and feel like, I mean, we've had plenty of them, right? When you are the reserve currency, things tend to be less dramatic than if you are a small currency like we had. But Europe has had enough debt crises to understand what the anatomy looks like.
Okay.
So what it looks like is, so you get a country, for example, like Japan or China, who hold a lot of American debt, but that's not the problem. The problem is the financial markets decide America can't pay. Now, if you just do the back of the envelope calculations, if the rate of interest is 5%, American debt is, let's say, 30 trillion. You're talking 1.4, 1.5 trillion interest rate payments a year alone, which is bigger than their military budget. Now, that is phenomenal, right?
Yeah.
And so all I'm saying is the one thing that might, in the short term, and in the short term, I mean in the next 4 years, undermine, besmirch, degrade this MAGA project will be the very financial markets that they are hoping will be behind them. And lastly, I think it's highly likely that Trump will try to urge one of his mates to become the head of the Fed, the Federal Reserve.
And then what would happen then?
Well, then, of course, the Federal Reserve, which used to stand outside the government and used to be regarded as the institution that was charged with preserving the integrity of the currency, of which there are many things can impinge on that, one of which is too much debt.
Yeah.
Then it changes dramatically. So if Trump were to lean on this individual and say, you know, your mandate is growth, keep the growth rate going, then you could see, as happened to Britain, Britain is the canary in the coal mine. Britain was, before the First World War, the preeminent currency, sterling.
Yeah.
By the mid-1920s, it was a currency that was consistently in crisis, and people couldn't get their heads around it. So it is a possibility.
And what if the likes of Japan, which I think hold $1.3 trillion or something,
Better be more than that. That's only a day's work.
and whatever China holds in the debt, what if they say, you know what, give us me money back, mister?
Well, the interesting thing I've always been fascinated by Japan in particular, why they held American treasuries.
Yeah.
Because their currency, for most of the period they held currency, I'm talking about through the 80s and 90s, was rising against the dollar. So it meant they were losing money every day by holding American debt. And you think, well, why were they doing that? And of course, what they were trying to do is they realized that American debt is the currency through which they buy Japanese things, Japanese cars.
Okay.
And it's better for them to engineer long-term market share in America for real things and take a hit on the financial balance sheet, which is not real. It's actually only financial. And that's what they did. So the Japanese,
they're in trouble now, though,
for a
aren't they?
long, long time, acted what would be regarded as against their financial interests, but in their strategic interests. But that's a way of thinking that we don't deploy or involve ourselves in. So just to come back to Trumpism, Trumpism is a real thing.
Yeah, sure is.
He is not an aberration. He is surrounding himself by people who are true believers.
Yeah.
He has got the extraordinary situation for the first time in 20 years, the Republicans have won the popular vote. He's got J.D. Vance beside him, who's a young, definitely more radical version of himself. And this is popular in America. We, because we read our media and our natural proclivity as Europeans, and particularly Irish people, is to be pro-democrat.
Yeah.
But we really need to see that we lost, right?
Yeah.
And they won.
Yeah.
And you always have to understand the psychology of the winner, particularly if you're the loser.
Yeah.
And I fear in Ireland we'll do what we always do, which we will put our head in the sand and say, it'll be grand. She will get the bit of shillelagh and we'll go over on Paddy's Day and who knows, right? And I think we've got to figure out we're dealing with a different creature. And this is why I started with this big idea of epochs. We are moving into a different world. And the world that you and I were adults in, the economic world, is over. And what you find is what happens in America passes across the Atlantic to Europe with a lag of a couple of years. That was before the internet. That was before WhatsApp, before all sorts of social media. Now, those movements are passing instantaneously. There's almost frictionless passing of ideas, of movements, of notions, and they're moving quickly. And that's the new world.
Well, let's hope it's a bit of crack.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Whoa. Thank you so much.